June 1942. The Pacific Ocean is a vast expanse, a shimmering battlefield where the future of the war hangs in the balance. For the Japanese Imperial Navy, the vastness of the ocean has always worked in their favor. They had been the masters of the sea, their fleets unmatched in size and power. The war was theirs to win, until now. As Japanese officers stand on the deck of their mighty carriers, eyes trained on the horizon, they have no idea what's about to unfold. From the distance, a new kind of threat is closing in, a force they have not yet seen. The American aircraft carriers. Unlike anything the Japanese have encountered before, these carriers are enormous, their presence a silent promise of destruction. The first time the Japanese come face to face with these titans of the sea, they are stunned. The American carriers, massive and brimming with fighter aircraft, make their move with calculated precision. For the Japanese, it is a moment of pure disbelief. How could an enemy so seemingly ill-equipped have such a formidable fleet? As the battle begins, they realize too late that the Americans' naval power isn't just about numbers. It's about innovation, strategy, and the shocking size of their aircraft carriers, a size that would change the course of the Pacific War forever. In 1942, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. The Japanese Imperial Navy had established itself as the dominant naval force in the Pacific, having achieved early successes such as the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and subsequent rapid advances across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Their fleet was comprised of formidable battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines, all working in unison to establish Japan's control over the vast Pacific Ocean. The Japanese believed they had the upper hand, not just in terms of naval technology but also in tactics, having honed their strategies in the years leading up to the war. The aircraft carrier had emerged as the key player in modern naval warfare, displacing the battleship as the symbol of naval dominance. Japan's carriers, such as the Akagi and Kaga, were massive ships designed to carry large numbers of aircraft into battle. The Japanese Navy had perfected the use of aircraft carriers, relying on them for their flexibility and firepower. The aircraft carrier became the heart of the Imperial Navy's strategy, with naval battles being decided by the outcome of air raids launched from these floating fortresses. At the time, Japan's carriers were considered among the most powerful in the world. However, the United States, having been drawn into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, was quick to adapt. Though the U.S. Navy had been caught off guard by the Japanese attack, the American leadership understood that victory in the Pacific would require innovation and strategic thinking. The U.S. Navy's response to Japan's early victories was swift, and they quickly began to focus on increasing their naval strength, particularly their aircraft carrier fleet. The American aircraft carriers, initially seen by the Japanese as inferior to their own, had been constructed in response to the evolving needs of naval warfare. Unlike the Japanese carriers, which were designed primarily for rapid deployment and offensive strikes, the American carriers were built to be larger, more versatile, and able to carry greater numbers of aircraft. The U.S. Navy's carriers, such as the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown, had been designed with a different approach to naval warfare, one that emphasized long-term sustainability, adaptability, and overwhelming firepower. In particular, the United States had made significant strides in aircraft carrier design and carrier-based aircraft development. American carriers were often much larger, allowing for greater capacity to carry both bombers and fighters. This gave the Americans a major advantage, as they could deploy a more diverse range of aircraft for different purposes. The Japanese, while they had perfected the tactics of carrier-based aviation, had not anticipated the size and operational capacity of the American fleet. The turning point came with the Battle of Midway in June 1942. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States began to regroup and build up its fleet. The Battle of Midway was a decisive confrontation that would demonstrate the full capabilities of American naval aviation. The United States, with its intelligence gathering, superior strategy, and technological advantage, would confront the Japanese Navy in a battle that would change the course of the Pacific War. The key difference at Midway was the sheer scale and power of the American carriers. The Japanese, having underestimated the American fleet, were caught off guard by the size of the U.S. Navy's carriers and the scale of their operations. The Americans, having learned from previous encounters, came to the battle with more aircraft, a greater variety of bombers and fighters, and a more sophisticated understanding of how to use their carriers to maximum effect. For the Japanese officers who had been trained to believe in the superiority of their naval forces, the sight of the American aircraft carriers in action was nothing short of shocking. These enormous ships, brimming with aircraft, proved to be far more capable than the Japanese had anticipated. As the American carriers launched devastating airstrikes on the Japanese fleet, the Japanese found themselves at a severe disadvantage, unable to counter the sheer power and coordination of the American carriers. The scale of the U.S. aircraft carriers, combined with the American ability to operate them with precision and overwhelming force, was a revelation that stunned the Japanese military leadership. For the Japanese, the introduction of these massive American carriers into the Pacific theater represented a profound shift in naval warfare. They had long relied on the strength of their own carriers, but the United States had just demonstrated that they possessed an advantage in both the size and operational capacity of their fleet. This realization marked the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance in the Pacific. As the Battle of Midway demonstrated the effectiveness of American aircraft carriers in securing naval superiority, the psychological shock of seeing the enormous American aircraft carriers and their overwhelming capabilities was felt deeply among the Japanese officers. The battle revealed not just a tactical loss, but an entirely new approach to naval warfare that the Japanese were unprepared to face. The vast size of the American carriers, their ability to carry large numbers of aircraft, and the coordination of their airstrikes would prove to be game-changers in the Pacific conflict. The Japanese had underestimated their adversaries' technological capacity, and the sight of these massive American ships forever altered the Japanese military's perception of the war. For the Japanese officers, who had long considered their naval fleet to be one of the most advanced in the world, the sight of the American aircraft carriers was nothing short of a revelation. They had built their entire strategy around the concept of air superiority, with their aircraft carriers forming the backbone of their offensive power. The Japanese fleet, particularly the carriers like the Akagi and Kaga, had dominated the Pacific early in the war, and the officers believed their fleet's capabilities were unmatched. They had always prided themselves on their precision and tactical brilliance, their ability to strike swiftly and decisively. But when the Americans revealed their enormous aircraft carriers, the Japanese officers were left in stunned disbelief. The scale of the U.S. carriers, their sheer size, and the number of aircraft they could carry was something the Japanese had not anticipated. The American carriers could deploy larger and more diverse aircraft, including bombers and fighters, with far more firepower than the Japanese had expected. For the Japanese officers, who had spent years refining their tactics and strategies, this revelation marked a profound shift in their understanding of naval warfare. They had been accustomed to quick, decisive strikes, but the Americans' carriers were built for long-term engagement and sustained offensive action. The Japanese had underestimated the scale of the American fleet, and this misjudgment would prove to be one of the most critical errors of the war. The Japanese officers' disbelief was not just a result of the size and power of the American carriers. It was the realization that the Americans, despite having been caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, had rapidly adapted, learned from their mistakes, and created an unstoppable force. The psychological shock of seeing the American aircraft carriers in action was immense. The Japanese officers had long believed that they were the masters of the Pacific, but now they were confronted with an adversary whose technological and strategic advancements had turned the tide of the war. For many of these officers, this was a moment of reckoning. The realization that their fleet, once considered invincible, was now facing a force capable of matching and surpassing them was a bitter pill to swallow. The sight of the American aircraft carriers marked the beginning of the end of Japan's naval dominance, and the Japanese officers were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had underestimated their enemies in the most critical way possible. The introduction of the U.S. Navy's enormous aircraft carriers into the Pacific theater marked a profound shift in the tactics and strategy of the war. For Japan, the aircraft carrier had been the centerpiece of naval warfare, and they had built their entire naval strategy around the superiority of their carriers, especially the A-6M-0 fighter. However, the American carriers, which had been designed with an entirely different approach to naval warfare, proved to be far more versatile and effective in combat. One of the key differences between the Japanese and American carriers was the size and capacity. The Japanese carriers, while formidable, were smaller and could carry fewer aircraft. The American carriers, such as the USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, and USS Hornet, were much larger, capable of carrying not only fighters but also bombers, which added a layer of complexity and adaptability to their missions. This increase in size and versatility gave the U.S. Navy a significant tactical advantage, as they could deploy multiple types of aircraft for different purposes: fighters for air superiority, bombers for long-range strikes, and dive bombers for precision targeting. The strategic advantage of having larger carriers was immediately clear during key battles such as the Battle of Midway. The American carriers could launch sustained air raids against the Japanese fleet, overwhelming them with a combination of fighters and bombers, while maintaining a level of protection with their own defensive aircraft. In contrast, the Japanese carriers, although highly effective early in the war, were now at a disadvantage. The American carriers could strike more effectively, providing a broader range of tactical options that allowed them to continuously pressure the Japanese fleet. The coordination between American aircraft carriers and their escorting fighters also marked a shift in how naval battles were fought. The American carriers were able to launch coordinated long-range strikes, something the Japanese were not prepared for. The Japanese, relying on traditional tactics of quick strikes and dogfights, found themselves unable to adapt to the new reality of naval warfare in the Pacific. The Americans' use of multiple carriers working together, providing air cover and launching simultaneous strikes, made it impossible for the Japanese to effectively counter the attack. The tactical flexibility of the U.S. carriers was a game-changer, and the Japanese were slow to recognize the impact of this shift. The battle for air superiority over the Pacific was no longer about a single carrier or a small group of ships. It was about overwhelming force, sustained attacks, and the ability to strike at multiple targets simultaneously. The American aircraft carriers, with their size, firepower, and coordinated tactics, had proven themselves to be far more effective than their Japanese counterparts. The tactical shift was profound. The U.S. Navy had moved from a defensive posture to an aggressive, offensive strategy that put the Japanese on the defensive. The moment that would forever change the course of the Pacific War arrived on June 4, 1942, during the Battle of Midway. This was the first major clash between American and Japanese carriers, and it would mark the turning point in the naval struggle for control of the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, despite being outnumbered and facing a formidable Japanese fleet, had managed to prepare for this battle with intelligence and strategic planning that the Japanese had failed to anticipate. At the heart of the American strategy was the key role of the aircraft carriers, the massive, powerful ships that the Japanese officers had initially dismissed, believing their own fleet to be the superior force. In the early hours of June 4th, as the battle unfolded, the Japanese were operating under the assumption that their carriers were far more advanced and powerful than anything the Americans could muster. The Japanese fleet, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was part of a larger operation designed to draw the U.S. Navy into a trap. The Japanese believed they had the advantage, not only in numbers but also in the firepower of their carriers. However, the Americans had been preparing for this very moment, gathering crucial intelligence that had enabled them to anticipate Japanese movements. The first shock to the Japanese came when American dive bombers, launched from the U.S. carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, struck with devastating accuracy. The Japanese had expected to confront American bombers, but the sheer force and coordination of the American assault took them by surprise. American bombers hit their targets with precision, and within minutes, the once proud Japanese carriers were engulfed in flames, their aircraft and crew destroyed in a matter of hours. The Japanese had failed to recognize the full potential of the American aircraft carriers, and their fleet, which had been the backbone of Japan's naval strength, was now crippled. For the Japanese officers, the reality of the situation was horrifying. They had been certain that their carriers, with their experienced pilots and superior tactics, would defeat the American forces. Instead, the sight of their fleet disintegrating before them, burning and sinking in the space of a few hours, was a moment of pure shock. Incredibly, the Japanese had been forced to face not just the American bombers, but also the massive, coordinated power of the American carriers, which had turned the tide of the battle. The scale of the American success at Midway was unlike anything the Japanese had anticipated. Not only had the Americans succeeded in destroying 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, but they had also done so with fewer ships and far less experience in combat than their Japanese counterparts. The battle, which had started with Japan holding the upper hand, ended with a massive loss for the Japanese Navy, both in terms of ships and morale. The psychological impact on the Japanese officers was immense. They had seen their strategic advantage evaporate in the face of overwhelming American innovation and force. The revelation of the size, firepower, and strategic coordination of the American aircraft carriers was a shock they were not prepared for. For the U.S. Navy, the victory at Midway represented a moment of extraordinary triumph. The defeat of the Japanese carriers was not just a tactical win, it was a strategic turning point in the war. The U.S. now held the advantage in the Pacific, with their aircraft carriers proving to be far more capable than the Japanese had ever imagined. Midway marked the end of Japan's dominance at sea and the beginning of a new phase in the war, where the United States would take the fight to the heart of the Japanese Empire. The aftermath of the Battle of Midway was felt across the Pacific, reverberating far beyond the immediate destruction of Japan's carrier fleet. For the Japanese Navy, it was the moment when their most powerful asset, aircraft carriers, was shattered. The loss of 4 carriers, including the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, not only crippled Japan's ability to project power, but also exposed a fundamental weakness in their strategic approach to naval warfare. The carriers, which had been the core of their offensive power, were now gone, and with them went the aura of invincibility that the Japanese had once held in the Pacific. The Japanese officers, who had been accustomed to the dominance of their aircraft carriers, now had to confront the cold, hard reality that the balance of power had shifted. The sight of the American carriers, larger, more capable, and with more versatile aircraft, was something that the Japanese had not anticipated. The sheer scale of the American carriers, combined with the operational efficiency and tactical coordination displayed at Midway, demonstrated that Japan's naval supremacy was no longer assured. The Japanese had believed their carriers to be unmatched in size and firepower, but in a matter of hours, they were left reeling from the loss of 4 of their most powerful ships and the aircraft that had been integral to their strategies. For the U.S. Navy, the success at Midway was a pivotal moment. Not only did it restore confidence in the American military, but it proved that American carriers, despite their relatively short history in naval warfare, could stand toe-to-toe with the best Japan had to offer. The victory demonstrated that American carriers were not just large and powerful. They were highly effective in battle, capable of coordinated strikes that could cripple even the most formidable enemy fleets. The American officers and sailors, who had suffered tremendous losses in the months leading up to the battle, now had a clear demonstration of the potential of their aircraft carriers. The morale boost was immediate and profound, as it proved that the United States could win the Pacific War, not just by overwhelming numbers, but by outsmarting and outmatching the enemy at their own game. The Battle of Midway also showcased the importance of intelligence and strategic foresight in modern warfare. The United States had cracked the Japanese code and gained valuable intelligence about the Japanese fleet's movements, allowing them to plan a devastating ambush. This foresight, combined with superior tactics and coordination, allowed the Americans to strike first and decisively. The Japanese, on the other hand, had underestimated the American response and were caught off guard by the American aircraft carriers, which were larger, more powerful, and more capable than they had imagined. This stark contrast in preparedness and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances underscored the broader shift in the war's momentum. In the larger context of the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway had far-reaching implications. The Japanese, reeling from the loss of their carriers, would never again have the ability to dominate the Pacific in the way they had before. The American victory marked the beginning of a sustained campaign that would push the Japanese back, starting with the island-hopping campaigns that would eventually bring the U.S. Navy to the doorstep of Japan. The victory at Midway gave the Allies the momentum they needed to shift the balance of power in the Pacific, and it was a critical step in the eventual defeat of Japan. The Japanese, unable to replace their losses in carriers and aircraft, now found themselves on the defensive. The loss at Midway not only stripped them of vital resources, but also broke their strategic initiative. From that moment onward, the Japanese would be forced to react to the growing American presence in the Pacific. The psychological shock of losing 4 carriers, compounded by the realization that American air superiority had grown unchallenged, was devastating. The Japanese could not recover from the blow dealt at Midway, and their fleet was never able to regain the offensive advantage it had held previously. For the Americans, Midway was a symbol of resilience and adaptation. What had begun as a desperate struggle to defend the Pacific became a demonstration of American ingenuity, tactical brilliance, and, ultimately, overwhelming naval power. The American aircraft carriers, once seen as inferior to the Japanese, had proven themselves to be the deciding factor in the war's ultimate outcome. The Battle of Midway marked a dramatic shift in the Pacific, where the United States would now take the initiative and maintain it until Japan's eventual surrender in 1945. The aftermath of the Battle of Midway was nothing short of devastating for the Japanese Imperial Navy. In the days and weeks following the battle, the full extent of the losses began to sink in. 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, along with their air crews and fighter aircraft, were gone. The loss of these carriers, especially the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crippled Japan's ability to project power in the Pacific. These carriers had been at the heart of Japan's naval strategy, and their destruction marked a critical turning point in the war. Strategically, the Japanese Navy found itself in a position of retreat, unable to maintain its previous level of naval dominance. The loss of the carriers disrupted Japan's operational plans and left a vacuum in their ability to defend their vast Pacific territories. The Japanese fleet had been designed with the carrier as its centerpiece, and without the carriers, the Japanese could no longer launch the kinds of large-scale, coordinated airstrikes that had once made them so formidable. What followed was a prolonged period of defensive action, as Japan scrambled to replace their losses and adapt to a rapidly changing military situation. For the Japanese leadership, the shock of Midway was not just about the material losses. It was about the profound psychological impact on the Navy and the country as a whole. The Imperial Japanese Navy had long prided itself on its naval superiority and had based much of its strategy on the effectiveness of its carriers. The loss of these ships undermined the very foundation of Japanese naval power. The moral blow was heavy, and the realization that they could no longer dominate the Pacific had a far-reaching impact on Japan's overall war strategy. In the months following the battle, Japan was forced into a defensive posture, trying to regroup and halt the American advance. For the U.S. Navy, the victory at Midway was a monumental boost to morale and strategy. The success of American carriers, which had once been seen as inferior to Japan's, demonstrated that the tide of the war had turned. The U.S. had proven that it could not only fight, but also win, even against overwhelming odds. The victory at Midway provided a sense of validation for American efforts in the Pacific, confirming that the strategy of focusing on aircraft carriers as the centerpiece of naval power was the right one. It also demonstrated the effectiveness of intelligence gathering. Through code-breaking and careful analysis, the Americans had been able to anticipate and counter Japan's moves. The psychological impact of the American victory at Midway was immense. For the U.S. military, the battle signaled that they could fight and win at sea against a well-established naval power like Japan. For the Japanese, the shock of losing their carriers, especially after their earlier successes in the Pacific, was both tactical and psychological. It shattered the myth of Japanese naval invincibility and marked the beginning of a series of setbacks that would culminate in the eventual collapse of Japan's naval capabilities. The immediate military aftermath was also significant. With the Japanese carriers destroyed, the U.S. Navy seized the initiative and moved to exploit Japan's vulnerability. The U.S. began to push westward, launching a series of offensives in the Pacific, including the Battle of Guadalcanal, where American forces gained their first major land victory against Japan. As the Japanese Navy struggled to recover from the loss of their carriers, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps gained ground on several islands, establishing strategic bases that would pave the way for future offensives. For the Japanese civilian population, the impact of the battle was indirect but no less significant. The loss of the carriers weakened Japan's ability to protect its naval supply lines and, eventually, its home islands. As the U.S. Navy gained control of the Pacific, it began a campaign of sustained air and naval assaults on Japanese territory, further eroding the empire's power. The Japanese public, already burdened by the war, would soon feel the effects of this loss, as the military's ability to defend its home islands would be severely compromised. The shift in air superiority also led to an increase in Allied air raids on Japanese cities, which would contribute to the devastation that the country would face in the years to come. For the Americans, the victory at Midway marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy, bolstered by its confidence and new tactical approaches, moved into an offensive position, beginning the campaign that would eventually lead to the Japanese surrender in 1945. The Battle of Midway had confirmed that American carriers were the future of naval warfare, and this realization would shape the course of the war in the Pacific. In the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Imperial Navy's attempt to recover from its staggering losses was marred by an increasingly desperate struggle to maintain naval power. While the immediate physical toll on Japan's fleet was profound, 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and the loss of numerous experienced pilots, the psychological and strategic effects were far-reaching. Japan's once dominant position in the Pacific had been broken, and the cracks in their naval strategy were now glaringly apparent. The destruction of Japan's fleet at Midway was a blow that would take years to fully recover from, if it was even possible. The Japanese Navy tried to regroup and replace the lost carriers, but the task proved insurmountable. Not only had the loss of ships and aircraft deprived them of the offensive capabilities they had relied on, but the sheer numbers of experienced pilots and crews that went down with the ships created a catastrophic gap in their operational readiness. In the months following Midway, Japan found it increasingly difficult to field a force capable of challenging the U.S. Navy. As the Americans took advantage of this shift, the momentum was squarely on their side. The U.S. Navy had effectively seized control of the Pacific's airspace, And the loss of Japanese air superiority meant that U.S. aircraft could carry out bombing raids and establish forward operating bases without the same level of resistance. The ability to operate with greater freedom and less threat from the Japanese fleet allowed the Americans to launch a series of offensives, including the pivotal battles of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. These victories served as stepping stones for further American advances into Japanese-held territory. On the other side, the Japanese military leadership continued to underestimate the scale of the U.S. Navy's power. They continued to focus on small, localized victories, rather than recognizing the larger shift in naval dominance that Midway had revealed. Even as their fleet shrank and their aircraft production couldn't match the pace of the Americans, Japan's leaders believed that by launching smaller surprise attacks or attempting to cut off Allied supply lines, they could regain some of the advantage they had lost. However, these attempts were insufficient in the face of the Americans' overwhelming naval strength, which continued to grow in both numbers and capability. The shift in the naval balance of power also had significant implications for the broader strategic situation in the Pacific. Japan's once dominant offensive campaign was now on the defensive, and the Allies began to implement an island-hopping strategy that would allow them to bypass heavily defended Japanese strongholds and advance toward the Japanese home islands. This strategy, combined with the U.S. Navy's increasing air superiority, allowed for a steady progression of Allied victories, which would bring them closer to Japan's doorstep. For the Japanese civilian population, the outcome of Midway had an indirect but profound impact. The destruction of the carriers marked the beginning of a prolonged period of Allied bombing campaigns that would target Japanese cities, military installations, and industrial centers. While the Japanese military tried to defend its borders, it was increasingly unable to prevent the Americans from carrying out these strikes. In the years following Midway, Japanese cities were bombed heavily, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo and the eventual atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The loss of the carriers at Midway and the inability to recover from it had set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead to the collapse of Japan's war effort. For the United States, the victory at Midway had far-reaching consequences. Not only did it mark the beginning of a shift in the tide of the war, but it also confirmed the efficacy of American naval strategy. The U.S. Navy had proven that, with careful planning, intelligence gathering, and technological advantage, they could defeat the seemingly invincible Japanese fleet. The success at Midway allowed the United States to move forward with confidence, knowing that they could take the fight directly to the heart of the Japanese Empire. This strategic advantage, paired with the increasing superiority of American aircraft and naval firepower, would lay the groundwork for subsequent victories in the Pacific. Midway, as a victory, was not simply a battle won by greater numbers or brute force. It was a victory of adaptation, intelligence, and innovation. The Americans had learned from their mistakes, adapted to the challenges of naval warfare, and used their newfound understanding to decisively outmaneuver the Japanese. The defeat of the Japanese carriers at Midway did not just cripple Japan's naval capabilities. It broke the psychological dominance the Japanese had once held, opening the door to eventual Allied victory. The legacy of Midway is felt to this day, not only in its military significance, but in the lessons it taught about the importance of intelligence, adaptability, and innovation in warfare. It was the moment when the tide of the Pacific War definitively turned in favor of the Allies, and it set the stage for the final push that would bring an end to Japan's war effort. The Battle of Midway was not just a victory on the seas, it was a turning point that reshaped the entire trajectory of World War II in the Pacific. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers, along with the devastating destruction of hundreds of aircraft and the loss of seasoned pilots, marked the collapse of Japan's naval supremacy. More than just a military setback, Midway was a psychological blow that shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. It signaled that the United States, despite the devastation suffered in the earlier part of the war, had adapted and found the key to defeating one of the most formidable military powers in history. For the American Navy, the victory at Midway was a moment of profound significance. It not only marked the destruction of the Japanese fleet, but also validated their approach to naval warfare. The success of their carriers, despite being outnumbered, demonstrated that the key to naval power in the modern age was no longer about battleships, but about aircraft and the ability to project power from the sea. The defeat of Japan's aircraft carriers was a testament to American ingenuity and the strategic brilliance of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who understood that intelligence, coordination, and technological superiority would win the war. The psychological shift was equally important. For the Japanese, Midway was a wake-up call, an overwhelming confirmation that their naval dominance had been decisively broken. The belief that Japan could not be defeated at sea, once a cornerstone of their strategic thinking, was shattered. The loss of their carriers left Japan vulnerable, and from that moment onward, they were forced to fight defensively. The momentum in the Pacific shifted firmly in the Allies' favor. The impact of Midway was also felt in the broader context of the war. The United States, now with the upper hand in the Pacific, began a relentless campaign of island hopping, using their newfound superiority to systematically cut off Japan's supply lines and eliminate their defenses one by one. The victory at Midway laid the foundation for future successes in the Pacific, including the eventual battle for Japan's home islands. The Allies, having gained the strategic initiative, could now focus on bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. Midway was a critical lesson in the importance of adaptation and intelligence in warfare. The Americans, having suffered great losses early in the war, learned from their mistakes and made the necessary changes to not only compete with Japan, but to decisively defeat them. The United States had proven that, through innovation, cooperation, and a willingness to change their approach, they could overcome a far more experienced and seemingly invincible enemy. For the American forces, Midway was a victory that not only secured their position in the Pacific, but also shifted the balance of the entire war. The victory was not just about sinking enemy ships, it was about demonstrating the power of intelligence, tactics, and a willingness to adapt to an ever-changing battlefield. The defeat of the Japanese fleet at Midway marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers in the Pacific, and the lessons learned there would shape future military strategy in the decades to come. In the broader scope of history, the Battle of Midway is remembered as a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and the ability of a nation to rise above its early failures. It was a defining moment for the United States, not only in terms of military victory, but in the psychological and strategic shift it represented. The Japanese, once confident in their superiority, were now forced to reckon with the unstoppable force of American naval power. Midway demonstrated that in war, no advantage is permanent, and the tide can turn with a single well-executed battle. In the end, the victory at Midway wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about proving that, even in the darkest hours, perseverance, innovation, and unity could lead to triumph. The Battle of Midway, in its scale and significance, remains one of the most pivotal moments of World War II, shaping the outcome of the war and leaving an indelible mark on military history.